the first time I think I really moved very profoundly past a stage of doubt was when he started reading to himself. And that had happened with like zero formal instruction. And it didn't happen until I think Finn was late in his 8th year. So it was later than would be considered quote unquote normal in these days. And I'd had a lot of anxiety about that. And then all of a sudden it happened, and I had been reading about how that would happen and how I just needed, to relax and to be okay with it and to let it happen its own time. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm like grinding my teeth, telling myself to relax and be okay with the fact that he's not reading at 6, at 7, at 8. And then it happened. And within I'm going to exaggerate a little, but not a lot. I would say within almost like a month, maybe 6 weeks, he went from like reading picture books to reading like chapter books. And very shortly thereafter to like adult level chapter books. And so all of a sudden I was like, whoa, okay. A lot of the things that I had assumed about what a kid needs in order to learn to read are clearly wrong. And I wonder what else I have been taught about learning, and what other sort of like confidences and intuitions have been eroded through the system that I grew up in. And that's sort of all around. It's like, it's very, very pervasive in our world now. What other assumptions are wrong?
This is episode 36 of the Ownstream Podcast, featuring Ben Hewitt.
Welcome to the Ownstream Podcast. I'm Teresa Scoba.
And I'm Stephen Shelley.
And we just hung up with the totally inspiring and humble Ben Hewitt, who is doing so many things that we find interesting and exciting. That this was a fantastic conversation. We mentioned at the top of the interview with Ben that we found him through an article that our former podcast guest Sarah Warden shared that he had written in 2014, actually, about unschooling. And this is a topic that we have a lot of interest in, thinking about education with our daughter, how we're going to approach that, what excites us, what resonates. And so that's how we found Ben, and that's a primary topic of this podcast, though there were many, many more.
Yeah, I mean, you imagine somebody who has 2 kids in their teens, basically, who is unschooling. He's also doing a variety of other things very differently. They homestead, they live off the land. He says they live right at the poverty line, but they eat like millionaires. And their kids are an integral part of their lives, much more so than, say, if they were going off to school every day. Though I think his eldest son now is in school part-time at his choice, not by any sort of admonition from his parents or any other outside entity. So there is a little bit of traditional schooling going on. And one thing that Ben comes back to over and over and over again is that the image that most of us paint in our minds about this idyllic pastoral life that he must be living is not the case, and that they are still very much a work in progress, learning every day about how to educate and how to raise their children. And it's not something that he's figured out or is some sort of whiz at all. I think he's a little too humble, though, about kind of not standing by some things that he has learned, and those do come through in this interview. I think there are some things that he really does teach and convey and pass on about raising kids and about being facilitators as parents more than educators. And I think my favorite thing he said was about what unschooling really is not so much about unschooling your kids, because your kids haven't been schooled. In his case, they haven't been to school at all, but really about unschooling he and his wife as parents, and forgetting, kind of the traditional model of what education looks like, what learning looks like, and that kind of getting out of the way and letting your kids follow their excitement, follow what's interesting to them, and embracing that, which as he points out through a very clear example about his youngest boy, can be rather challenging.
Yeah, I mean, this is overall like really in and out about Ben and his family and his children, a fantastic conversation about what it means to learn, how that's a spiritual practice, how that comes through you, how getting out of the way is the most important thing, both for him and for as he's unschooling his kids, which he makes a very clear point that he doesn't love that word unschooling because it's more about what he's not doing than what they are, which is creating this rich, textured learning environment for their kids where basically their natural curiosities and interests can come out and flourish. So we did want to say in this intro that there were so many doors that Ben opened that we didn't get to go down because of the limited time that we had. If you're interested in any, learning more about anything we didn't quite get to or cover in this interview, we'd love for you to just, post in the comments. We both thought that we could have another long conversation with Ben another time, or certainly follow up with him for more information.
Yeah, the URL for this episode, if you want to post follow-up questions for Ben, is ownstream.co/Ben Hewitt, B as in boy, E, N as in Nancy, Hewitt. And if we get a few questions in there that are particularly interesting, we can ask Ben to respond, or even better, get him for a follow-up episode, because we did have a very firm stop time on this call, and it's an hour, which is a long time. But given the breadth and of how Ben lives and how he and his wife have chosen to live with their family and all the things that they're doing, there's so many kind of avenues that we could go down with them. And if you're interested in that, we're interested in that. So let us know. If we get a few questions in there that kind of provoke a lot of kind of discussion, then I think what we would do is follow up with him for another interview sometime soon. The other thing you'll notice is that we ran out of time at the end. We did not ask him our usual quota of 3 questions. So what we've done is followed up via email with those. So look in the show notes for the books he recommends. We will also link in the show notes to what he has written. He has a few books that are very much to the topic of unschooling and homesteading, and that if this topic is interesting to you, you'll probably want to get those books. But we also ask him for self-published non-books by him that he recommends people read. And so check out the show notes for those as well.
And the last thing we wanted to say, I think, is that we would love it if you like this episode and are enjoying the Ownstream podcast for you to leave us a review on iTunes. We've had a few recently that have just been fantastic to read. I mean, really exciting. We always love feedback from our listeners. We're getting a lot more of it lately. We love hearing from you, and it especially helps to promote and move forward the podcast to have some more reviews, ideally 5 stars if you're enjoying what you're hearing. But we welcome all the feedback from you. We've even had the opportunity while we've been here in Sedona to meet a couple of our listeners, and that's been really exciting to interact and feel how the ideas and concepts and ways of living that we're sharing are being received.
Yeah, one thing about this lifestyle that we live and about podcasting, and I think other podcasters would agree, is that we're recording this in Sedona. We're not near you. We don't probably in many cases know who you are, and that's exciting on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's a little isolating. And we would love to know what is inspiring to you. We'd love to know your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. Send us a note. The way you can help us is to put that, as Teresa said, 5-star review into iTunes. The more reviews we get, the more visibility we get, the more people we can inspire and touch and reach and expand, and that's our mission. So help us do that. Give us that review if you would, please. So, okay, I think that's enough from us. We will be back afterwards to wrap up, but until then, enjoy our conversation with Ben Hewitt. All right. Well, Ben Hewitt, welcome to the Ownstream Podcast. Thanks so much for being with us, and we're super excited to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate you asking me to be on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Ben. So there's a lot of things that we're excited to talk to you about, but we found you through your article in Outside Magazine about unschooling, which I know was a few. Yeah, I know it was a few years ago, but we just a friend of ours and former podcast guest, Sarah Warden, who we discussed world schooling with, shared that article, and we found it while we were on the road in our van, and we just totally lit up and resonated, and we're kind of cheering through the whole article. We thought we got to talk to this guy because of especially the topic of unschooling your sons, but also about a lot of the ways that you live your life. So especially now that we have our own 1-year-old, and we're thinking about what education looks like now and what it will look like. So thrilled to have you. So maybe we can get started. We like to talk to our guests a little bit about their origins and how they ended up on the path they did. So we know that you grew up in a small cabin on a homestead in northern Vermont, and you have a homestead now with your family. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your childhood. Was it unconventional in many ways, or were there aspects that were fairly mainstream?
It was, both. How about that? That's the short answer. And I would say the ways in which it was unconventional is that, as you mentioned, I was sort of born into a homestead in northwestern Vermont, and for the first 6 or 7 years of my life, lived primarily. I say primarily because actually for the first year of my life, I was in a farmhouse while my parents were building this cabin. But then for the rest of that period of time, from age about 2 to 7, lived in a 2-room cabin, no running water, no electricity. My parents were very, very much of that back to land, early 70s, late 60s, early 70s generation of back to the landers, and lived it pretty full score. I mean, my dad was, so much so the cliche is so complete that my dad was writing poetry and my mother was working at a farm down the road, milking cows, and they drove a Volkswagen Beetle. And, it was really like when you sort of close your eyes and picture homesteading in Vermont in the late 60s, early 70s, that's what it was. And then when I was about 6, 7, I don't remember exactly, my dad actually did eventually end up getting a job, a sort of regular job. I mean, interestingly enough, both my parents were very, very highly educated. My dad had a master's, and there was a lot of education behind them. And I think, I think one thing that happened is there was a lot of poverty. Basically, we were living really, really close to the bone, and it was really like that poverty by choice, and not so different than the way actually I live right now with my family. We've chosen to live a very simple life of modest means. But I think that can also be, even though it's by choice, those who have the luxury and the privilege of being able to step outside that often do make that choice at some point. And my parents made that choice. And so at that point, my childhood became a little bit more conventional in the sense that we moved to a place that was closer to where my dad had taken a job. And there were light switches on the walls. There was a toilet in the bathroom. There was a bathroom at all, actually. That was kind of a novelty. So we had all of these sort of 21st century, or even 20th century, I guess at that point, American luxuries, first world luxuries. One thing that remained a little atypical is that we still didn't have a television. And except for a period of about, I don't remember exactly how long it was, maybe a year, maybe it was 2 years. In my childhood, there was never a television in the house. And I want to I'm pointing that out because I actually think that in many ways, growing up without a television probably saved my life. And so I'm really loath, actually, at this stage of my sort of evolution of sharing our story and of talking about and writing about parenting and education. I'm really sort of loath to give really direct advice to people. One piece of advice I do give that's often very direct is to say, you know what? It's just like the bumper sticker says, kill your television. That's the one piece of advice I feel like I can just sort of unreservedly put out into the world. That, and people will make the argument, well, there's some good shows. And you know what? There are actually some good shows on TV, but it's just not worth it. And there's other ways to consume media and to be more particular about the media you consume, especially in this age of all the internet stuff that's out there and the way technology has changed that landscape. Anyway. My childhood became more conventional. I went to school. Excuse me. I was never homeschooled. And I went through grade school, junior high, high school. I was really a very disinterested, disengaged student for most of my schooling, and actually ended up dropping out of high school at the age of 16 in the middle of, I think, my junior year. Mm-hmm. So that's where my story, my personal educational story, sort of starts to diverge from what might be more assumed, particularly coming out of a family, not a well-to-do family, a very middle-class family, but with a very highly educated family. Mm-hmm. So that was the beginning of a sort of different track for me. I did ultimately end up going on and getting a couple of semesters worth of credits at a state college. But I never completed my bachelor's. I did get a GED also, but I never completed my bachelor's degree. And yeah, tell me where you want to like veer into modern day. I mean, I
was this one quick question. Was this like just a straight up public school, local school, school bus? That
straight
whole
up public school. Excuse me for a second. I'll apologize to your listeners. I have a little bit of a cold, so I'm going to be stopping frequently to drink water and cough and blow my nose and whatnot. Straight up public school. It's interesting to me looking back on this that there was never any conversation about what an alternative might be. Mm-hmm. And I actually haven't talked to my parents about that. And I would be interested to talk to them about it. If there just wasn't an awareness that there are other programs out there where I might have thrived. Mm-hmm. There wasn't much money in our family at that point. We were still sort of coming out of that period of self-imposed poverty, and we're still sort of, I think my parents were still sort of clawing their way into the middle class. So that may have been part of it, but we never talked about that. And I just ended up dropping out of school.
Were they super disappointed? Were they like,
what was
oh my
their
God,
reaction?
what are you doing?
I think they were really aware the school wasn't working for me. I'm sure there was disappointment. I don't mean to suggest that but to their great credit, and this is, the height of irony. My dad worked for the Vermont Department of Education at the time, and my mother was substitute teaching. So, it was, I think, as I pointed out in that article that you referenced, that Outside magazine article, not only was like, I sort of ironic that I'm coming from this family where there's been a lot of faith placed and value placed in education. But, education was sort of the hand that fed us, and I was sort of flipping my finger to it. As I like to say, most of the saying usually is I was the first child of my family to go to college. It's like I'm the first child of my family to not go to college. Right. So there was this sort of I think assumed path that I just sort of veered from. For better or worse, I still don't even know, to be super honest. But that was the path. And I also think it's important to point out that it wasn't like I was I had some sort of higher purpose in life. So I was not like some sort of child prodigy that wasn't being well served by the public education system. Basically between you and me and whoever's listening, I was a metalhead stoner who was kind of frittering away my high school, my teenage years. That's kind of what it boils down to. And it, so it wasn't working on some level. I left school. I went into the, trades as a sort of the low man on the low person on the totem pole in a number of construction jobs, and kind of made my way doing construction, biking, ski bumming. I was into being outdoors and adventure sports, until I met my girlfriend, now wife, on a job site when I had just turned 21. I was working on a construction site, and she was there actually also working on the site. And that's sort of where my path sort of veers again toward the life that I'm living now.
And did you, from those early years homesteading, when you met your wife and you decided, what your next step was going to be, were there elements from that childhood that, did you always know you wanted to go back and be on a homestead? Like, what happened next in terms of what you wanted to set up with your family?
I didn't know that. I should point out at some point in this conversation that I just described myself as a metalhead stoner during those years. At some point, I did actually stop smoking weed, by the way, and I'm no longer a metalhead stoner. I'm just a metalhead.
Metalhead stoners do sniff a lot and cough regularly. Just putting that out there.
Not even really a metalhead anymore. But there was not. That was not part of my vision for my life at that point. I was really I had, like I mentioned, gotten really into cycling. I was actually went from being, sort of a classic sort of teenage ne'er-do-well, I guess, to being a competitive athlete. I was a competitive cyclist for a number of years. When I met my wife, I was really into competitive cycling. And I, for a while thought that was going to be the rest of my life. And so we kind of, ended up, there was, I think, always this desire, and this was particularly true after I met Penny, because she was also someone who, what's the right word? I think felt the desire to have a great deal of agency over her time and her life. Like we both, just from the get-go, really valued, a sense of autonomy, a sense of agency, of just like doing our own thing and not necessarily following the path that may have been assumed for either one of us. Because she grew up in a very well-educated, and in her case, much more sort of, my parents actually were kind of, that sort of liberal, like whatever, back to the land, like I said, movement. Her parents were actually much more sort of suburban, for lack of a better word, mainstream, I guess, conservative. And so we both were sort of veering, I guess, away, or willing to think about our lives unfolding in ways that maybe no one would have anticipated for us, if that makes sense.
Sure does. One question that comes up for me is, like, were there forks in that road? Like, did you find yourself in a job you didn't like, or did you guys find yourself like, going to grocery stores and being like, oh man, this is crazy. We have this land. We should be growing our own food. Like, talk about some of, maybe one or two, if any come to mind, of those little decisions.
Yeah. I mean, well, for me, Penny was a real fork in the road, because she was already really interested in farming. She was working at the time on a commercial organic vegetable farm. Cool. And she knew that she wanted agriculture to be a big part of her life. I don't think, at that point, she understood what form that might take, but she knew that she wanted to have her hands in the soil, and that was the work she wanted to be doing. I think within that, her own self-awareness, or her knowledge of what she wanted to do, I recognized something that I could really like connect with, which was that desire to sort of like, make a life, of our own, like have this, again, that sense of agency, like to do something a little different, to create for ourselves something that would not require that we end up in jobs that we hate, just so that, we're paying the bills that we somehow managed to accumulate, which we, like that kind of stuff like sneaks up on you really fast in my experience. Mm-hmm. And both of us, I think, from the get-go, really had a sense of like not wanting that to happen. And I often, make the point that a lot of this life is really about me being kind of lazy. And I don't mean like I'm actually physically lazy, because I'm not. I'm actually very, very active and work very hard to make this life work. I'm lazy in the sense that, and lazy is really not the right word, but I'm lazy in the sense that, I'll just keep using it, even though it's not the right word. Lazy in the sense that I really have a high degree of discomfort at the idea that I will get stuck in a job that I don't like, because I have to pay bills that, I would just rather not have. So I guess a lot of what we're trying to do is, yes, there are other values. It is values driven in other ways. It is also a lot about just like our personal sense of liberation and freedom to live and spend our time the way we want to spend it.
One quick question I have, and I know Teresa has a question to follow up on that, but is, so at a certain point, you guys have kids, and how was the conversation before you had kids? Did you guys talk about, all right, we want to raise these kids this way, we want to do things like this, or was it less planned out? Talk a little bit about kind of the introducing of children into your lives, into your family.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the best way to talk about that is to talk a little bit about some friends of ours that I lived with during a period when Penny and I were apart for a summer, when she was working elsewhere and I was up in Vermont doing my thing. And I talk about this in that Outside article. I lived with this single father and his two young sons, and he homeschooled his kids. And it was the first, my first like real intimate exposure to children who'd been homeschooled. I'm sure I knew what homeschooling was. In fact, some of my best friends from childhood had been homeschooled, but as a sort of and I guess what I'm saying is, as an adult, as someone who maybe was starting to think about what it might be like to have kids of my own, it was my first experience in sort of observing from that vantage point, or being in contact from that vantage point with kids who were homeschooled. And I just sort of fell in love with these kids because of their, you get into a whole sort of like, cause and effect, causal relationship here. They were really amazing, interesting, bright kids. Would they maybe have also been amazing, interesting, and bright had they been in school? Very, very possibly. Mm-hmm. But for whatever reason, I sort of correlated their just zeal for life, their energy, their brightness with their homeschooling, and just was like, wow, this is really amazing. These kids are amazing. I didn't really know this was possible. At least not from the vantage point of like looking at this as possibly a future parent. And when Penny came to visit me during that period and met these kids and this father, she had the same sort of reaction. Like, and all of a sudden we were like, if we have kids, I think at that point it was an if we have kids, we're gonna homeschool our kids. Mm-hmm. And of course she had to sort of, she had gone a little bit further down the path of the sort of more prescribed, typical path with education, to the point where she actually didn't drop out of school till she was one semester shy of a BA at the Rochester Institute of Technology. So she made it a little further, but we both, had this sort of experiences with the more formal educational system that left us both feeling ultimately a little cold and empty. So there was that part of our backdrop and our bias also, obviously.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up, and it includes this on that idea of creating a life of our own. You said that a couple times. And that's a lot about what this podcast is about. I wonder if you could kind of, maybe moving into what your life looks like now, tell us a little bit about what that meant to you guys in terms of value driven and how that's manifested in concretely what your life looks like today.
Yeah, well, it definitely meant, I remember very, very well this really strong sense, and this was before we had land. So this would be going back, 25-ish, almost 25 years, 22, 23 years ago. And, these conversations we used to have about when we had land, and in my own, heart and just, this really strong feeling of wanting connection to a piece of land and wanting to be on a piece of land. I didn't even at the time really care or think all that much about growing food, or, I didn't have this really clear vision of how that would manifest itself, but I had a really strong sense of that need for that connection. So I remember that really, really strongly. When we bought our first piece of land, I was still really into competitive cycling. I was, was expending a lot of energy on that, as one will. And, it was sort of like, we got the land, and things just sort of started to happen organically. It's like we got chickens and we enjoyed having chickens, and it was like, oh, let's get some pigs. And, we naively thought that would be really easy. And we got some pigs, and then I had all these horrible dreams about killing them. But, and we, Penny, meanwhile, was cultivating gardens. And I just sort of like started to come to it more and more as it sort of started happening around me. And then we had kids, and, there's a real, at least for us and for me, a real symbiotic nature with that kind of work, and that life with the land and having children as part of that. And so I think, having kids was another sort of, it was a deepening of that connection, not just with my family, but also with my relationship with the land and the work we were doing on the land. So it just sort of snowballed, honestly. It just, we both like got more and more invested and more into it, frankly. It was never for us, although we do grow overwhelmingly the majority of the food we consume, we do, for us, it's never really been just about the food, I guess. And I always sort of joke that like, the food is honestly just a nice sort of like byproduct of the work itself. Mm-hmm. For me, I really need that. I need that physical outlet. I need the work. I need that sense of like purpose in my days. Like if it would be really, unsettling for me if I had to sort of like wake up to the reality that like I didn't need to go do chores, I'm not saying that like there aren't days in the year when I wake up and it's like, shit, I got to go do chores because it's 38 degrees and it's pouring rain, or I'm sick, or, I don't know. It's not like I want to be really careful to like disabuse people of this idea that like this is all perfectly bucolic and all we do is run around like, sipping dew out of flower petals. And like, that's not what I'm talking about here. The challenge of it and sometimes the hardship of it and the times when, it frankly just kind of sucks. I mean, that's all part, I think, of that connection and deepening that connection, frankly. Mm-hmm. And that commitment to that, I guess, is part of what I'm talking about. Like, if that suddenly went away, I would be a little untethered. I'm not saying maybe I couldn't figure out some way to, replace that for myself, but it is very important. I mean, to me, this work, my relationship to our animals, it's very much part of, a spiritual path for me. It's not just about the food, I guess. Sometimes I think people want to fixate on the food. I get it. Like we eat like ridiculously well and like incredibly. I mean, we don't even hardly drink milk. What we do is we skim the cream and we feed the skim milk to the pigs and we just drink the cream. Right. So like we eat so well, we have very, very little money, but we eat like, we eat better than millionaires, like any millionaire I know. Mm-hmm. So that is part of it. I don't want to diminish that, but I often feel like even if the food weren't there as the end result, I would probably still want to do the work.
Wow, that's great. There's about 10 possible follow-up questions to that, but looking at our time, I want to kind of steer towards the unschooling topic, and maybe the way to do that is to so you had this exposure to these kids, these vibrant, exciting kids who were homeschooled, and so that became kind of a compass for you guys. Like, okay, we're this is the kind of thing we're interested in. Talk about kind of forming, if you will, your own philosophy around schooling, and what if you will, like what is unschooling? What does that mean for you?
Okay. Yeah, we can go with it. Yeah, this is great. Okay, so unschooling, I mean, first of all, I really don't like the term unschooling. It is definitely, I use it still all the time because if there is any sort of like popular term, to the extent there is a popular term exists for what we do, that is the one. And it's also kind of a provocative term. So sometimes it can just be a good conversation starter. But I think, I guess the reason I don't really like it is because it does a much better job of describing what we don't do than what we do, if that makes any sense.
Sure.
So, and it was definitely not what we had originally intended. I mean, we started out with the assumption that with our older son, who's now 15, and I'm going to go on for a while here. Feel free to interject, but our path has changed a lot. And some of, our ideas have evolved. And I think that's really healthy and really good. And I am always having to remind myself, to not get stuck in my own dogmatic thinking. In other words, I am often asking other people, challenging other people to step outside their dogmatic thinking. And I have to remember to apply that to myself. Right. Yeah. And the older I get, this is one of the benefits of getting older, I find, is that you realize how little you know. So the older I get, the less I know, and that is actually amazingly liberating, and the less in control I feel, and that's actually a really, really liberating thing. So I speak about all this from a place of, in some ways, increasing uncertainty. So probably now all your listeners are like fleeing in droves because they realize I have no friggin' idea what I'm talking about. But anyway, that's what I feel like when I talk about this stuff, is that I don't really know. I know what my experiences have been and what I've observed in our family. But I don't know what's best for anyone else. I can't say that, we've made all the perfect choices or any of that kind of stuff. So I just want to make that really clear. So I'm going to back up. So we had originally assumed that we would follow a much more sort of conventional homeschool curriculum, probably like a Waldorf-based curriculum that sort of appealed to us. And that was just like a dismal failure for us with our older child, who was like 5 or 6 at the time. And I sort of I've recounted in a couple of things I've written about, how we sort of sent him down and we bought him all of the proper, like really expensive pastel colored crayons and the heavy, thick, like creamy art paper that costs like $12 a sheet or something like that, and we were all like prepared to embark on this wonderful, nurturing path of, expressing himself artistically, and he wanted absolutely friggin' nothing to do with it and just threw tantrums constantly and like broke the crayons and threw them against the wall and tore up the paper. And it was like, we had at that point to really examine a lot of our assumptions about what this was going to look like. And so what we sort of ultimately realized at that point was that compelling him into any sort of curriculum or, basically we just needed to let go is what it boils down to. And so we did, and it took a huge leap of faith. And I remember really well, like, the first time I think I really moved very profoundly past a stage of doubt, was when he started reading to himself. And that had happened with like zero formal instruction. And it didn't happen until I think Finn was late in his 8th year. So it was later than would be considered quote unquote normal in these days. And I'd had a lot of anxiety about that. And then, all of a sudden it happened, and I had been reading about how that would happen and how I just needed, to relax and to be okay with it and to let it happen its own time. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm like grinding my teeth, telling myself to relax and be okay with the fact that he's not reading at 6, at 7, at 8. And then it happened. And within like, I'm going to exaggerate a little, but not a lot. I would say within almost like a month, maybe 6 weeks, he went from like reading picture books to reading like chapter books. And very shortly thereafter to like adult level chapter books. And so, all of a sudden I was like, whoa, okay. A lot of the things that I had assumed about what a kid needs in order to learn to read are clearly wrong. And I wonder what else I have been taught about learning, and what other sort of like confidences and intuitions have been eroded through the system that I grew up in. And that's sort of all around. It's like, it's very, very pervasive in our world now. What other assumptions are wrong? And it happened almost exactly the same way with our second child. Our second child is of a very different temperament. I suspect if we had tried to embark on a more curriculum heavy program with him, he probably would have done okay with it. Actually, I think, I'm guessing because we never did, but just his temperament is so different. I suspect he might have been fine with it. So in some ways, I'm like really grateful that we had this first child who, temperamentally sort of challenged us to open our minds a little bit about what his education was going to look like.
Maybe you can tell us a little more about, so you tried the kind of more formal curriculum route, and that wasn't right, for your oldest son. And can maybe tell us a little bit about how you balance this fostering of the innate interest and curiosity and awareness and everything that's in your sons with what you want to teach them, what you believe you need to teach them, and what you've learned about learning in the process.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think we really tried to let go of an agenda about what we felt like they needed to learn and what we needed to teach them. And really, I mean, I talk about this a lot, like the process of unschooling our kids. It's not our kids who needed to be unschooled, honestly. It was Penny and me that needed to be unschooled, right?
Right.
Our kids had never went to school. That was not really the problem. The problem was our own, assumptions and the ways in which, we'd come to a place of thinking that it needed to look a certain way. and letting go of that kind of stuff. You know, I will say, I mean, there's been a lot of years intervening since our older boy is 15 now. And we're talking now, so we're going back 10 years. There's a lot of things have happened in the intervening years. And some of our ideas have changed and shifted. Some of what, his needs have been, he's got different needs now as a teenager that are very, very clear, and he can emphatically state, and that, he's now old enough to start to make, different decisions that are really, he can take agency and authority over. So he's a much more autonomous human being. He is in school part-time right now because he wants to be. And that was another sort of aspect. I mean, I think sort of ironically, unschooling at some point for some families actually means, letting go of their assumptions about what their life is and their education is going to look like outside of school, and saying, hey, I sometimes hear from parents who are just so distraught because their child has decided that they want to go to school, either part-time or full-time. And I guess what I'm saying is I think it is really important for us all as parents. I guess, here's another piece of advice. I guess I feel pretty confident in giving. One, kill your television, right? And one, kill your television. Two, leave yourself very open to the idea that things are not going to work out as you might have anticipated. Because guess what? They're not. Right? You guys have a 1-year-old, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, things are going to be so radically different than you can even possibly imagine.
Right.
I hope I'm not breaking your heart. You guys are going to get off of this call and just probably be totally dejected. But
no, we
that child
every
is good.
Day.
Good. I'm glad because I think honestly, I think it's really easy as parents, and I speak for myself here, or maybe I should just speak for myself. It's really easy for us to have these ideals and these ideas and these ideals about, who our kids are going to be, what their childhood is going to look like, what we're going to be able to provide for them, what their education is going to look like. And I think this happens a lot actually in the homeschooling community, because a lot of the people who have made that decision to homeschool have done so because they have put a lot of thought and energy into what they want their children's education to look like. They're not just sort of going with the flow, right? Which is a great thing, and I applaud that, and I think it's really important. But the danger in that, I think, is putting too much emphasis or placing too much certainty or having too rigid an idea of what it's going to look like as an alternative. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Totally. I want to quickly kind of just jump in and just say what your oldest son went to. He chose to go to school, and was it friends, social? Was it he wants to be in that sort of structured learning environment? It's much more about just he's always had friends, and he's always had those outlets, but at some point, and we've seen this happen a lot, and I think we just sort of never thought it was going to happen to us, but lo and behold, we're no special snowflakes here, right? We're living in the shit just like everybody else, honestly. I mean that metaphorically. It's just, and I don't even mean it's that bad. It's just that life is, life is what it is. It presents you with all sorts of surprises and challenges. But, for him, it was just he's a very extroverted person who just wanted, and as he got older, more and more of his friends actually started going to school themselves that had previously been homeschooled. Uh-huh. And so, that just began looking more and more appealing to him. So he goes very part-time, and he's still homeschooled. I don't even know what percentage, but you would call it, because really what we do for homeschooling doesn't really look like what a lot of people think of as homeschooling. But he is in school part-time. Got it. And it was necessarily because he just wanted to be around people. Right. Yeah. Well, so you just alluded to it a little bit, but so assuming there is no typical day, but maybe you could talk about what does a day look like? How do the kids fit into that? What does learning look like from their standpoint? That's kind of the first half of the question. Then I'd like to follow up the follow-up to that, I'll just tell you what it is because you may be able to merge these, but is like when you notice your kid, in your Outside Magazine article, you talk about one of your kids, and I can't remember which one, having a natural interest in something and how without you even doing anything, suddenly they had a wealth of knowledge about that. And I'd like you to talk, too, about kind of encouraging, nudging along, what that looks like from the ground. Like when you see your kid interested in something, what do you do? I mean, do you go out to the toy store and buy him a bunch of XYZs or, what does it look like? Yeah.
Yeah. Those are all really great questions. I mean, our days actually are kind of typical in the sense that we live a very land-based existence in a 4-season climate. There are just like these repeating patterns of, what really have become ritual for us. Mm-hmm. So there's firewood, there's maple sugaring, there's all these things that are, part and parcel of the season at hand that are part of our days. And we've been doing them so long now that they just sort of are part of the rhythm of our life. So there's like our life, I feel like, in one sense, our days are not the same as one another, but in this other sense, they do tend to repeat throughout the course of the year in this sort of, there's like this repeating overlapping cycle. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yes, I hope it does, because that's what it feels like anyway. And it's like, so today may not look like yesterday, but I also know that like we're in fall right now, and there are going to be things happening over the course of the next months as we finish up our preparation, or weeks as we finish up our preparations for winter, that are going to look a lot like exactly what we were doing this time last year. And I'm going to slowly, we're going to slowly be transitioning out of, for instance, harvesting to, preparing the gardens for winter, there is always something different thrown into the mix. Like right now I'm doing some work on the house that, I probably wouldn't necessarily be doing otherwise this time of year, but there's always something else going on. But, and for the kids, I mean, it's a little different now because you're speaking to me when they're at an age, our younger son just turned 13, they are definitely at an age when they're not necessarily so intimately involved in everything Penny and I are doing. Mm-hmm. Right. So they have kind of their own, a much more stronger sense of selves and the things that they want to be doing and how they want to be spending their time. And though, of course, there's a certain amount that they're expected to contribute to the well-being of the family, they also have a lot of opportunity to follow their own pursuits. Our older son that we were just talking about, he's gotten really, really into music. He's a real avid guitar player and is really interested in kind of like almost all aspects of music. So that's what he spends a lot of his time doing. Our younger son is very, very into what I guess a lot of people call primitive skills, but once you start like learning about them, you realize they're not very primitive at all. But so more like traditional land-based skills, and he spends, he in his own way is repeating that sort of same cycle around the seasons, but it's around those kind of pursuits more than like the homestead, agricultural based pursuits. So he's a really avid hunter and trapper and just outdoorsman in general. Cool. So that's what he spends most of his days doing.
And how did you first see that begin to form in him, that interest?
Well, I mean, we saw it first in our older boy. I mean, he was the one who sort of, I think, got his brother interested in it. And that happened really early. There's this story I relayed. Where did I can't remember where, but maybe it's in my book. But we had it was this experience. I mean, we had always, for a long time had been raising and slaughtering our own livestock. And we made a decision really early on that we were not going to sort of, quote unquote, protect the boys from that they were going to be part of that. And we were going to be very open about that experience with them from the get-go, from a very, very young age. So they were always present for that, the killing of those animals and the processing of those animals. And when our older boy was, I guess he was about 5, Penny found him over by this stream. And he had found a mouse in a trap, and he had actually skinned the mouse and sort of dismembered it. And he had the two like rear haunches of the mouse that he had tied up and were hanging from a branch.
Whoa.
And Penny asked him what he was doing. He said, "Oh, I'm hanging the hams to cure."
Oh, wow.
And, that was like, whoa. Okay. So, and we were really resistant at first, honestly. Like we were told, neither one of us grew up in families where, guns and that kind of life was just like that wasn't part of our lives, really. I mean, we raised these animals for slaughter, these domesticated animals for slaughter, but it's a very different thing than sort of like hunting and the trapping. We were especially resistant to because we just like associated that with cruelty. We just really felt like we didn't, and we resisted and resisted and resisted and resisted. And it was so this is actually going to merge with your second part of your question. Like, what do you do when they express an interest in something? How do you, what's the process there? And for us, it's always been, there's just like a high level of facilitation. Mm-hmm. And so when we realized that this wasn't just going to go away, that we couldn't just keep saying no, no. I mean, I guess we could have kept saying no, 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 but we didn't keep saying no, no, no. We, in this very specific example of trapping, which was something we were totally uncomfortable with, we set out to find somebody who like trapped in the old way, who could show them how to do it ethically, who used every part of the animal, who wasn't in it for money, but was actually in it for the relationship to the land, to the animal. And we actually found somebody like that.
Cool.
And he was kind enough to take them on and mentor them. And so, to this day, my older son doesn't do as much. He still traps a little, but my younger son is still very avid. And, he eats everything that he traps. So beaver, muskrat, I mean, I've eaten my share of both, and they're not delicious as far as I'm concerned. But he eats them, and all of the, the furs, he makes things with the fur. And anyway, I'm maybe going off on a little bit of a tangent. But so yeah, I think, we had the luxury of like being able to sort of be there and bear witness. We resisted for a long time. And I think it's, this is really common, is like sometimes our kids will get involved in things that maybe don't particularly excite us as parents, and that can be really challenging, and how to sort of like deal with that. And then, and then back to your other question of like, what is the process? For us, it has been like, okay, you have an interest in X, Y, or Z. I know friggin' nothing about X, Y, or Z. Let's find somebody who does. So it's always been about the idea that like, how can we facilitate you learning more? And often that means, and this is one of the great, wonderful things about, blessings about this style of education, is the people that if you are willing to do the outreach and ideally have your children do the outreach, honestly, is that it will bring you into contact with really, really amazing people. I will say, as will the public education system, right? Like my experience, having now a more intimate experience with the public education system, my critique has never really been with the people working within that system. In my experience, and I remember this from high school, I mean, I hated school. I hated it. And I had teachers that I loved and still have a relationship with to this day. And I don't know that everybody working within the system is, feels this way. But in my experience, most of the people who work within the system are really, really doing it with the best of intentions and want to do really positive things with kids, and often themselves feel just as stymied and see the shortcomings of the system just as clearly as those of us who have chosen alternate routes have, So it's never really, I always want to be really careful to, I can go on and on about critiquing what I like to call the institutionalized educational system. But it's really, there's just like, I think the flaws are really much more systemic than they are interpersonal, I guess. And most of the people working within that system really, really are trying really hard to do good work in the context of system that's really, in a lot of ways kind of broken.
Yeah, we both feel that way. We both have teachers we love and had profound impacts on us too. I know we're running out of time with you, Ben, and I wanted to get back before we close about purpose, because you mentioned that, and I've been thinking as you've been talking about your sons and their innate interests and curiosities and how you foster that, how this plays into your sense of purpose. And you had said that the way you've designed your life has allowed you to live your purpose as a spiritual practice, and just wanted to kind of hear a little bit more about that. How are you, both through this unschooling, but also through the other aspects of your life, living your purpose? How have you designed your life in that way?
Oh, that's a great question. Because I feel it. I just don't know that it's always, or let me put it this way. Sometimes I feel it, right? There are times, and honestly, there's a lot of the time when I think my life feels like as much of a muddle as just about anyone's might, I think that's sort of the nature of life. Life is by nature, I think for most people, challenging at times and involves a certain amount of suffering. And that's true for me too. I think it's been, for me personally, I mentioned that sort of like connection with the land. I think, a connection to sort of my relationship. When you choose this path, and I should point out, I should make one other point before I go too far into this, which is that this style of education can look a million different ways from a million different families. So when I talk about what it means to me and what it looks like for us, that's not necessarily what unschooling means to anyone else, if that makes any sense. Sure. So I think that's really important to remember that. I think some people hear something like unschooling and they assume that kids have no responsibilities, or they have there's no agenda. There's no, that's just and that actually is true in some families. I think it's very true in some families that kids who are unschooled can watch as much TV as they want. They can eat ice cream for breakfast if they want. There are different ways that people do this. That is not what it's like for us. So I just want to be really clear about that. And for one, because we have put a lot of emphasis on facilitation, on trying to sort of help our kids, find their way and pursue their interests, it has compelled us to be a larger and greater part of their lives than we probably would have experienced otherwise. And here again, I think there's a lot of risk. I think you can become, really too involved with your kids' lives. And I think it's really true that we inhabit a very child-centric culture. And that part of that child centricity is because we have moved away from more intact communities. We have really moved more toward the nuclear family as community. And we tend to rely more and more on our kids to fill that void in our lives. And I would say that, looking back on, my experience as a parent over the past 15 years, I think there are times I have veered too much in that direction. And, learning when to pull away and to not facilitate or to not be there is actually a really valuable thing too. That said, I think the intimacy with my children, the time with my children has pushed me up against myself time and again. And, people talk about long-term relationships and marriage as being something of a crucible, and I think the same can be said of parenting, and the same can definitely be said of parenting, when that relationship is at sort of sometimes focused and intense as it can be when your kids are around as much as ours, and when we're working with them on a day in, day out basis. There's no question. I return to that idea, of I look at chores as, chores are kind of my church, and that sort of that waking up in the morning and that responsibility and commitment to the animals under our care is in and of itself an act of real, at least for me, real love and devotion, that to me feels profoundly spiritual. And, I could go on, I guess, but I'm also really grateful that, because we've chosen this path, and because we have flexibility and maybe a little more autonomy over our days than is typical in 21st century America, I have more of an opportunity just to sort of be outside on the land, in relation to the land in that way. I have that time and that flexibility and that freedom and, frankly, that privilege. And that's really, really profoundly important to me. And I try really hard not to forget. I mean, we live, basically at the poverty level. And I try not to forget what a privilege it is that we are able to choose to do that. It's a huge, huge privilege. And I am really, really profoundly grateful. And it comes, it comes on the backs of a lot of people who've come before me who were not able to make the same choices. So I try not to forget that. And it's not perfect. I always want to stress that, because I feel like sometimes, people can read an article like that one in Outside, or they can hear a podcast, or they can come to my blog and they can see pretty pictures and they can get this idea, I think, that I've got it all figured out. And, I know before we started recording, we never really got to talking about how we make it work financially. And, I guess I'm just trying to make the point that and I sort of laughed when you said that, because, we're right now really sort of in this place of something's not working. We got to shake something up here, right? Things have got to be a little different than they are right now, because this isn't, so what I'm saying is it doesn't work for us. We don't have it all figured out. I want to make that really, really clear. We're here, living this life, and we feel really good about it. And it is, there's a lot of things that are really, really true and beautiful, but it doesn't mean that we're liberated from all of the sort of, confusion and challenges that, most families face in this day and age. And I just want to, I don't know. I just feel like that level of honesty is really important to me.
Well, Ben, we're out of time. We appreciate that. That's really clear. And I think we're all works in progress. As a friend of mine said, who has 2 kids about your age, he says, no one has any idea what they're doing with their kids.
Yeah, it is. There's this great blog out there that is no longer active, and I can't even remember how I stumbled across it. It's a parenting blog with sort of a Buddhist perspective, but I think I may get it wrong, but I think the title of it is One Continuous Mistake.
That's great.
And I just loved it because, it kind of is. That's what it feels like sometimes. And then, of course, sometimes it feels like you're on top of the world and you do have it all figured out. And, I certainly relish those moments just as much as anyone else does. So, that's, there's another small piece of advice, when it feels like you got it all figured out, man, just hang on to that and really enjoy it, because it's guaranteed not to last.
That's so good. That's great.
Well, thanks, Ben. We know we're at the top of the hour, so we got to let you go. We appreciate it. To our listeners, we usually ask 3 little coda questions. I may follow up with those with you via email, because I think that our listeners might be interested in some book recommendations you may have, and I'll just zip that over to you via email. We'll put those in the show notes.
Okay. Yeah, great.
But thanks a lot, Ben. Appreciate your time. Great to connect.
Thanks to you. Thanks, Stephen and Teresa. Take care.
All right. That is it for this week's Ownstream Podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this awesome interview with Ben Hewitt. Be sure to check out the show notes for this episode for links to everything mentioned, including Ben's site and blog, the Outside Magazine article we reference, all his books and writings, plus the other books he recommends, and much, much more. All of that can be found at ownstream.co/Ben Hewitt. That's ownstream.co/BenHewitt.
Also, please sign up for our weekly tip-off email at ownstream.co and just click the sign up button in the upper right-hand corner. This is where we share each Monday 3 cool things we've learned in the last week in the areas of lifestyle, business, and spirit. This could be an amazing quote, individual, tip, or tool designed to bring you more freedom and power in your life. So definitely sign up for that again at ownstream.co and just click sign up.
And as I said before, we want to encourage you to leave us a review on iTunes. We really need your help in expanding our reach, helping us to inspire more people and spread the amazing ideas discussed on this episode with Ben Hewitt and others. If it feels right to you, simply go to iTunes, Search for the Ownstream Podcast, click ratings and reviews, then click that 5th star and leave us a brief comment on how this episode has inspired you. Thanks so much for considering that. We are most grateful.
Finally, we're on Facebook and Twitter at Ownstream and on Instagram where we post regularly at own_stream. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you next week. Thanks for listening to the Ownstream Podcast. To learn more and connect with us, please visit ownstream.co or follow us on Twitter at Ownstream and Instagram at own_stream.